Hi, thank you for joining us this evening. Apologies, we're a little bit late. We just had a few technical difficulties, but that's no issue. What we're going to do, just while we're waiting for a few new people and a few extra people to join, is we're just going to do a little bit of a poll with you all. So you should have a poll pop up on the screen right now, just to ask whether you are grazing or feeding fodder beet. If you could just fill that in. And while you're filling it in, and I can see some people are ticking, so it must be working, we'll just go through what we're going to cover this evening. So we're going to talk a little bit about using fodder beet for beef and how that works in New Zealand with our speaker, Dr Jim Gibbs. Why graze fodder beet? What are the cost implications compared to housing? What performance you can expect from growing and finishing beef cattle? Lifting beet and how that would work in a TMR. All about building organic matter and carbon with fodder beet, and then moving on to integration of fodder beet, grass and herbal leys in a rotation. So hopefully that is what you have joined for tonight, and that's what you're expecting. So I will just close that poll. So we've got about a half and half of the people that have joined us, Jim and Mark, between yes, half of them are grazing fodder beet and loving it, and half of them aren't, but are thinking about it. So we've got a really interested audience, which is great. This webinar will be recorded and you won't be able to speak as attendees, but you are able to ask questions and we want you to do that. So just to run through how to do that, you should have a little orange box on the side of your screen. If you click that, it'll pop out, and in the question tab, you'll be able to type your question in. Please type them in throughout and I'll ask them on your behalf later on. And just to check that is working, if you just put in now which county you're watching from, so where in the country you are today, and we'll just check that that comes through. And while people are doing that, I'll just introduce Jim and Mark. So Jim, did you just want to introduce yourself and who you are and what you do?
Thank you for that. My name's Jim Gibbs. I teach at Lincoln University in New Zealand, and I teach in livestock health and production. And I've spent the last 15 years or so developing the fodder beet grazing systems that we'll talk about tonight. And the area that I work in most cases is in ruminant nutrition.
Perfect, thank you. And Mark, yourself?
Yeah, so I work as a grazing consultant, so do a lot of rotational grazing and a lot of outwintering. So I work partly with KWS, really looking at setting up farms on fodder beet, and work pretty closely with Jim throughout. Great.
And people are just putting in now where they're dialing in from as well. So you've got some from Staffordshire, Cornwall, Yorkshire, a couple from Scotland and Leicestershire as well. So we really have got everyone coming in from everywhere, with Norfolk and Suffolk just coming in at the back then as I was speaking. This webinar tonight is joint with ABP Prism 2030 as well. So we've got Katie Thorley online. So Katie, did you just want to introduce yourself and say a bit about why ABP wanted to be involved with this?
Yep, no, thanks, Emma, and thanks for the invite to do this joint webinar with yourselves and Mark and Jim. So ABP, we have got the Prism programme, which hopefully there's some of you guys are on board this evening. We are helping improve helping our farmers think of different ideas of what they can do to hopefully get themselves to be more sustainable for the years to come. Obviously, that's what is sustainability. There's a lots of other different meanings about that, but hopefully fodder beet can come in there as to help some of the farmers become more sustainable. So we were keen to add that element and that topic into our knowledge exchange, because we've been doing lots of meetings on grazing and soils and all sorts of that side of things throughout January. So this fitted really nicely with the February topic. So thanks for letting us join.
Great, thanks Katie. With that then, we'll hand over to Mark and Jim, and just a reminder to type your questions in as we go, and I'll ask those on your behalf later on. So Mark and Jim, over to you. You should have the screen. Perfect, we can see that.
Okay, all right, thank you very much. So we've introduced both of us who'll be speaking tonight, and I think you've already introduced what we'll be talking on, so an emphasis on beef and sustainability. And we'll spend our time in the first instance in talking the beef systems that are in New Zealand and have been used in New Zealand at great scale for some years, and how they may, or in some cases may not, apply to the UK experience. And we'll look particularly at finishing rather than store cattle in this webinar. We'll look at finishing young animals, that's 16 months old, and perhaps talk about some of the advantages in that. We'll look at finishing the older, the traditional sort of age for finishing them, and then we'll move on to some of the costs and why there might be an advantage in the UK in moving out of sheds and approaching various forages, including fodder beet, differently. And then we'll talk a little more around how that might be integrated into existing sheds, and then specifically look at some of the soil carbon issues that are the subject of research right at the moment. Okay, so our New Zealand systems are slightly different to the UK in that if you look there with our finishing cattle on beet, it's very rare in New Zealand to have suckler cows that are either fed, certainly fed on any of the winter forages, or fed on any concentrates. So the picture to the right, you can see that you have hills behind the crops. Nearly all of the suckler cows in New Zealand are on the hills. So when we come to talk around suckler cows later on, it's not something that's done in New Zealand at any scale. So nearly all of the beet, at least in the beef industry in New Zealand, is used in finishing cattle. We will spend some time talking on the use of beet on top of pastures, because it has a direct relevance to some of the herbal leys that are particularly in the east of the UK, but that is a minority use of beet also in New Zealand. So we'll spend our time talking about finishing. So maybe there's something fundamental to remind people, and most of the audience, I would guess, has already had some experience or at least heard the basics around fodder beet in general. One thing to remember with fodder beet is it's effectively two crops in front of you when you're grazing that as a standing crop. You've got the bulb down the bottom, which is really relatively low in protein and very high in sugar. And on top of that, you have the leaf, and the leaf contains, for all of our purposes, almost all of the protein and a good amount of the calcium and phosphorus that's required. Now, that sugar in the bulb is where most of the problems occurred in the early days, because that sugar is really no different to the starch in grains. So effectively, when you're introducing these animals, it's no different than introducing them to grain-based rations in a feedlot or in a shed, or at least high input grain-based rations in a shed. So the very first thing to mention with beef finishing is that one of the important components to it, and the major advance in New Zealand that really led to beef being as widespread in beet being used in the finishing beef systems as widespread as it is now, was the fact that you have to have this transition to the crop. Now, the second component, and that transition we've spoken about elsewhere, and effectively it's a 14-day program where you start with very little and you end up at unrestricted intakes. Now, that unrestricted intake is very important for beef, and we'll come back to that later on. The other component is that in the main with these beef finishing diets, you tend to use very little of anything else. So if we're talking about supplements on a beet diet, we'll normally be talking about whatever else they're eating while they're on that beet diet. So in this case, it'll be either direct grazed pasture, silages, or hay. Now, we said that we'd look at two different systems. So the first of these systems in widespread use in New Zealand is the system that takes the weaners and then puts them for a relatively long period of time across autumn and winter into the early part of spring until the grass growth is coming up, and then finishes them on grass at a young animal. So in those cases, something around 14 or 16 months old, rather than the traditional New Zealand approach, which is to finish them at 28 or 30 months old. So in these cases, what we would do is it's almost entirely in New Zealand straight beef breeds, not dairy beef, but straight beef breeds. And what we would look for is a weaner somewhere above 250 kilos, often 270 or above, and we would put them on a long period of beet. So they're on at least 150 days and often a little bit longer. They would start in that autumn period, and the middle of autumn, while it's still relatively warm and while there's some grass there, they'd be transitioned onto that crop. And once they're transitioned onto that crop, they would stay on it through the winter months, and they'd stay on it into the early part of spring. We're quite careful to do this until there's good grass growth around them. So when they leave that crop, they're on unrestricted intakes of the pasture as well. So as a general rule of thumb, what will happen in those cases is while they're on that beet for that period, and often that 150-day period is what we're looking at, they'll do on average over that period about a 1 kilogram of live weight gain a day. As a consequence of that, if we're starting them above 250, it means that come that spring, when we've got 3 months of good grass ahead of us, we could bank on them being 400 kilos live weight or above. Now, what that would normally mean is that we can take them through that period with a high live weight gain on pasture. That means they're framed up. They've got, as a consequence of that high energy intake on beet across that autumn and winter, they've got a good frame to work with. They've got higher intakes, and that we can really get a very good live weight gain. 1.5 kilos is pretty common on that spring growth over that period. And therefore our target weight can be achieved before we run out of grass in the warmer, dry months of summer. Now, our target weight in most cases is a 300 kilo carcass, and because you get a higher carcass yield on beet than you do on plain pastures, what we need for that is a live weight, I should say, over 530 kilograms, and that gives us a 300 kilogram carcass, which is what we're aiming for. Our general pasture carcass yield expressed against live weight is about 52%. On beet for the British breeds, Angus and Hereford, it's about 56% for these animals at 14 to 6 months old, and for the continental crosses with British, it's 58%. So we're cribbing a little on our live weight because we're getting a heavier carcass per existing live weight. There are some trickier bits with the young animals, and we won't spend a lot of time on them, but they're a little fussier than the older animals, and they take a little more to get onto the beet. Often they haven't had a lot of experience with strip grazing of any sort, or sometimes with electric wires, so there's something there to be done. They also have a requirement for trace elements and a particular requirement for vaccination against clostridial disease. That's a very important one to remember because they're far more susceptible, and beet diets at this age bracket, when they're starting that post-weaning period, are a particular risk factor for sudden death from clostridial diseases. So it's important that they've had a full clostridial disease program before they get onto that crop and achieve full intakes. Now, the real advantages of this young finishing is it can be a very efficient system. You're at a really high stocking rate. It depends on the yield of the crop in front of you, but you're on a high stocking rate. The minimum stocking rate is something around 15 to a hectare, and the maximum, depending on the larger yield ones, can be 35 or so per hectare. For a longish period of time when there is no, in most cases in winter, when there's no other existing forages that are either of that yield or of that energy density to provide that live weight gain. It means that you're off the rest of the farm over that period in autumn, so it means you've got an opportunity to have some grass, and that becomes important in spring when we go to grow some more grass with it and get them off earlier. Now, the other system that's in place in New Zealand is the older animals. So these are, again, universally spring calved, but these will be in autumn around 18 months old. We typically look for 400 or better 440 kilo live weight, and that's for steers. It's lighter for the heifers. And these would be taken in beyond the middle of autumn, so typically in the last month of autumn. And unlike the younger steers, they're quicker to get onto this, so they have a shorter period of time and they're not finished on grass at the end. So what happens with these is that they're on this crop for typically 100 days. The starting live weight of 400 or 440 and a live weight gain of about 1.3 kilograms a day minimum for these ones means that we can target this beyond 550 with a similar carcass yield to what we've described earlier, which gives us a 300 kilo plus carcass. And the advantage of this system is that they're coming in, going directly onto the crop, so they're not on any other part of the farm. So these larger systems are all about trade steers. They're coming directly onto that crop, and then they're leaving that crop and going directly to the works. So they can be a very efficient system. And this is by far the largest sector of the beef industry in New Zealand that's finished on beet. There are some limitations to both of them. We said before with the young systems that they're are very efficient in particularly methane expressed against kilograms of red meat produced. There's about 100% reduction in methane for every kilogram of live weight that's produced if they're killed at 16 months old at 300 kilogram carcass, compared to being killed at 28 months old at a 300 kilogram carcass. So it's a very strong system improvement with that. The other we've talked about with high stocking rates, it means that contingent on the yield, that there's no other crop around that we could use that would pull so many animals off the farm into such a small area. And so effectively there's a farm saving, but there's also another effect, which is really that you're increasing the stocking rate across the whole farm. Because winter is often the period where the feed pinch is the greatest, if I'm able to increase my stocking rate in winter and hold more, I've got much better opportunity to take advantage of the spring grass. And then we've mentioned the other ones that we've got a very good carcass quality. Beet doesn't have a lot of carothone in it, so fat tends to be pretty white. And as a consequence, they're high marbling, they're white fat, and they're young animals, in particular the young ones, they tend to have a far greater reach into the more elite carcass gradings than the standard pastures on. If we were to look at the adult systems only, they aren't nearly as efficient in terms of their methane, for example, because they've been held longer on them, but it is much more efficient on a per farm basis because they come into that crop and they leave that crop. They don't need the rest of the farm to be used. Therefore, as a consequence, there's a far greater proportion of these that are finished like this in New Zealand. The second component is in pasture-based systems, if you're looking to use that forage, that cold season growth is the limitation. So from a processor point of view, you're able to get a whole lot more stock at a time when stock, or good stock particularly, are very hard to get. And again, there's some foreknowledge from the processor's point of view about the number of carcasses, the size of the carcasses, and the quality of those carcasses. So these advantages have really pushed it along in New Zealand, and they are available here in the UK, and I expect that they would do similarly. Now, if we would just look at some of these systems to understand, if people haven't seen that before, sorry, I've picked two very dry times later in spring to show you, but this is a sort of strip grazing approach. So for both of them, the left-hand side, they're grazing away from us, and the right-hand side, they're grazing to our left. Now, I mentioned before that suckler cows aren't used on beet in New Zealand because they're put in the hills, but the application for suckler cows is quite straightforward here in the UK, and a number of people are doing this effectively already. So as a general rule of thumb, you dependably expect them to eat at full intakes about 2.2% of their body weight. Now, in most cases, that isn't required to have those maximum intakes in suckler cows because they don't require a maximum live weight gains to maintain the condition that they're required for. But what it does mean is that you're still at mostly beet with very small amount of that supplement put in there. It does mean also that you can have very high body condition gains if they're required, and sometimes that changes management in autumn. And that in the dairy industry in New Zealand that uses beet is a very significant driver for beet use. I expect that it would be similarly done here in the UK. In most cases, that total crop is very suitable in terms of both the energy and protein, and in most cases, its mineral content for suckler cow use across that dry period. Utilisation levels outwintering often are really high, and it enables them to be grazed on this, again, at high stocking rates until very close to calving without any difficulty. And the equivalent of this is done at great scale in the dairy industry in New Zealand. Now, we said before that there isn't nearly as much of beet, harvested beet used on pasture in the beef industry in New Zealand. There's certainly a lot done in the dairy industry in New Zealand, but not in the beef industry. But the principle before it is that you can effectively halve the diet. Half of it is beet and half of it is a pasture base. And what can happen in this case is that it can be put out there a long time in advance. So for wintering, it can be put out 2 or 3 months in advance. But for the use in spring, for example, as a way of increasing stocking rate by increasing available energy per hectare use, it can be put out weeks in advance. So it's laid across the pastures, often with a simple wagon, can be pushed out with a by being smashed up by a muck spreader, for example. Various ways that can happen, and it'll stay there until they eat it. And utilization is very high in that pasture, and because pasture is almost always too high in protein, it's a good mix by putting high sugar, relatively low protein feeds onto a high protein pasture base. It's a very suitable mix. We'll spend a moment talking about the costs, and this is in the New Zealand scenario what initially drove the very strong increases in beet hectarage that were done, and of probably most interest to the farmers that we've been spending time talking to over the last several years here. And to put this in a very plain way to understand it, at current levels in 2024, there's no area in the United Kingdom that can't grow beet for somewhere between 7 or
Hiya, we've just seemed to have lost connection with Jim, so just bear with us a couple of minutes and we'll see if we can get that back up. I'll be back with you in a minute. What about now, Jim? I can't hear you, Jim.
The driver for beet use in the beef industry is the cost of beet being very much cheaper than alternative feeds on a dry matter basis or on an energy basis. And that certainly has been the driver in New Zealand to increase the use and drive the hectares that New Zealand has today in beet. So to put this in a plainly spoken context, there appears no area in the UK, so from the south to the north, that beet can't be grown for somewhere between 7 or 10 pence per kilogram of dry matter. Now, you occasionally hear that beet is an expensive crop. That just simply isn't true. Beet in most cases will be the cheapest feed on the farm except for grass. Now, as an example and a way of explaining that, I've put some information below here to using current prices. So as one example of that, if we were to look at grain, barley, for example, at 130 pounds a tonne or above, in the last several weeks, that would put it at somewhere between 13 and 18 pence for every kilogram of dry matter. For silages, depending on how you cost it out, what price your own grass was, but the cost of making it for most folk, it'll be above 10p for every kilogram of dry matter for a far lower metabolizable energy value. And then when we look at the cake or concentrates, the current prices as of this week, 370 pounds a tonne, puts them at 37p per kilogram dry matter. and that will be about the same energy, slightly lower actually, than the metabolizable energy value of fodder beet. So in terms of costs, if we were to pick on the rising 2-year-old, 18-month-old steers that we said before, and we were to round this off with some utilization losses and say that there was a 10 kilogram dry matter use per day, we'd be looking at something like 70p. With a couple of kilograms of silage included into that, we'd be looking at 90p, or to round it off, less than £1 a day. So out wintering and grazing in situ like that can be a very effective and very cheap way of maximal live weight gains. Now, one extension of that, which we said that we would include, was the use of beet in total mixed rations. Now, the concept behind it in terms of swapping costs remains, because in most cases farmers could grow it for the same cost. When it's included in total mixed rations, in the majority of those cases, it'll have to be harvested. Commercial harvesting, when the leaf's taken off it, which is then a loss to the system, and that commercial harvesting is then often required to be stacked, etc. It works out around 2p per kilogram dry matter for all of those taken into account. Sometimes it's involved in washing and chopping to be included in true total mixed rations. If it's included as a standalone feed and fed out in the troughs, that isn't necessary. But if it's to be included in the total mixed ration, it almost always has to be washed and then chopped up for it. And typically we put another cost of 1p for that. Now, you can see that for the same energy supply to the diet in those cases, there's a shift in price that still amounts to more than 1/3 of the more expensive concentrates that are going in. And compared against a straight grain with a similar crude protein content in most cases, you can see that it still remains, approximately half. So the use in total mixed rations is not without some fishhooks. One of the things to consider with this is that there is a difference between sugars, which beet is full of, and starch, which grains are full of, in terms of their efficiency of use. Now, as a general rule of thumb, it's approximately 10% shift. So you have a 10% greater advantage with starches over sugars in terms of animal performance. So that does have to be taken into account. However, you can, by looking at that simply, even if you were to increase that by 10%, you're still a long way away in terms of the total cost of the ration. The other advantage of keeping a small amount of grain in there, and that is in most cases what people have done, relatively small amount of grain and a larger amount of beet, is that that starch does have some other effects in the rumen in terms of preferentially producing some of the volatile fatty acids that can be very positive for animal performance for a few reasons. The disincentives to using beet in total mixed ration systems, though, really have to be outlined directly. And the major disincentive for using them is that they're wet. So compared to grains, which are 85–90% dry matter, only 10% water, most of the beet that people will be using will be between 15 and 25% dry matter. So therefore, up to 85% water. And because they eat it, they have to excrete that as the urine or in the feces. So as a consequence, if they're on high fodder beet in shedded systems, what you typically find is that you've got more slurry coming out, and therefore there is a cost that's associated with that. So it's not completely plain sailing with that, and it does have to be worked through carefully in the system. Where it's worked effectively and is working right now in the UK is some mix between them. So not totally replacing the grain, but in putting more beet into that system as a way of reducing costs. And now I'm going to finish with some new work, and I won't spend any great detail on this time, but perhaps in questions later we can pick it up again. But this is around the growing interest in soil carbon and also in soil nitrogen, particularly in nitrate leaching. This is some work that I've been involved with for some years. So one thing to point out with this that isn't always widely known is that almost uniquely amongst the crops, fodder beet has a very deep root, 3 meters odd deep, and it's a very active root because it's a long season grower. So that root is active from when it's planted, from the day that it's planted for the first 100 days. On average, it grows about 2 centimetres a day. So at 100 days, which is only a little bit over 3 months, those roots are 2 metres deep. And they're very metabolically active, and they bring up a lot of nitrogen from that depth. There's a lot of studies that have demonstrated this for 50 odd years, and some recent work at Lincoln has done the same. What you also find with them is they bring up quite a lot of water. But what isn't so commonly understood is this concept of soil carbon and putting it back into the system. Now, soil carbon can enter by various routes, but one very important, probably arguably the most important route for soil carbon is that there's a dry matter that's exuded or sweated out of the roots of plants. And as a general rule of thumb, that represents 10 or 15% of the biomass above the ground. So in our case, the crop yield. So if I'm putting in a herbal ley and I'm getting 5 tonnes a year for it, then I can expect 500 kilograms or so of that dry matter. If I'm growing a very large fodder beet crop, and the upper end of fodder beet crops in New Zealand at the moment is 44 tonnes. So if I'm growing that, I can expect a very large amount of that material to be put into the depth of the roots, which is 3 metres. So I've just put up some information here on a standardised 20-tonne crop. So that's 20 tonnes of dry matter per hectare. Now that's achievable across all of the UK. So if we were to look at that at 10 or 15%, that would mean 2 or 3 tonnes of dry matter being put back into the soil at a depth that's well below what can be achieved by ploughing. So in other words, it's out of reach. Now, in addition to this, as a general rule for these crops, there's about 2.5 tonnes of dry matter in the root material themselves. So this is the roots that aren't that are left, not the bulb, but the roots below that that are deep down into the soil. And the digestibility of beet, including the supplement, works out about 80%. Or put it another way, there's about 20% of that that's left in feces. On that same 20-tonne crop, if we're grazing in situ, that's 4 tonnes of dry matter per hectare. So if we were to look at this, it's perilously close to 10 tonnes of dry matter that's being returned per hectare. Now, there is no other crop around and no other system around, even including putting very high rates of shed muck onto the surface, that can put anything like this amount of carbon back to the soil. So this is an area of current research, and it particularly suits the east of the UK, where in recent years stock have been lost from those systems, and they've been constant arable enterprises. And where they're looking to put soil carbon back in there, growing very high yielding crops puts a lot more soil carbon back in than lower yielding crops. And I won't say too much around the soil nitrogen because Marc will pick up on some of this as well. But what I would say is, if we were to look across the most recent research that we've done in New Zealand, a very large number of farms, 120 commercial farms, all sampled in winter, where we looked at the total nitrogen percentage of that crop, it was on average 1.5%, and the top 25% of the operators, it was at 2% nitrogen. Another way to put this is that that crop has taken out of the soil at 20 tonnes of dry matter per hectare, 400 kilograms of nitrogen. The top end crops are taking out of the soil 800 kilos of nitrogen. So there has to be a conversation going forward around this, because this can be a very effective tool for rehabilitating soils where there's nitrate leaching down. So for example, one leaky crop use that won't move more than 1 metre of a year down into the soil could be picked up 2 years later by the beet crop being able to reach its roots down to the depth that it's got to and pull that nitrogen up. And this is another area that we're very interested in pursuing in the future. And with that, I'll turn it over to Marc. Yep.
We've just got a couple of questions, if you don't mind, Jim, whilst you're still there.
Certainly.
So the first one we've got through is, could you apply the trace elements, talking about the health side, can you apply the trace elements to the beet ahead of the cattle rather than a drench, e.g. a foliar trace element spray?
No, that's an easy one to answer. No. For the young stock in particular, I went over that rather quickly, but I'm happy to answer that at some detail. There's a requirement for a specific requirement for copper that often increases when they're eating beet, because they tend to have a lot more soil intake, and that soil will contain iron, and in some places in the UK, it'll also have a fairly high molybdenum content, and both of them can tie up the copper that's in the plant, and then it'll make it unavailable to the animals. So for the R1 systems in particular, all of them that are going on there would at the very least have a copper bolus and typically a selenium injection. A very common use in New Zealand is to use an injectable trace element that also has iodine, cobalt, and some others as well. There's a few varieties and different brands, but a common one is called multi-min. So to answer that plainly, there's no way of achieving that from the crop itself, and there wouldn't be any of the large systems that do that didn't directly apply them to the individual. I should make note of that though, because on occasion, another route that people had suggested to them was using licks. So some sort of salt lick or molasses lick or something. It's a very ineffective way of supplying trace elements to the stock on beet and should be avoided.
Okay, perfect. Another one that should be quite a straight answer as well is, can the audience have the links to the research papers on carbon that you've mentioned?
In some cases they can. In some cases at the moment they've been postgraduate student work that hasn't come to publication, and at least in the case of the examples that I've given there are being published this year. So okay. They're probably, I'm happy to have them contact me directly, and we'll give you an email at the end of the webinar if you like. People can contact me directly, and I'm happy to pick up on doing that with them.
Yeah, no problem then. So for the people that wanted that, either we'll get you Jim's details, or you can put them through to me and I'll get them from Jim as well. Another question, when beet tops start dying back from January onwards, how does that affect the digestibility and nutritional value, or does it not have any effect?
So there's two parts to answer that question. The first one, if we answer it directly, if the leaves in winter are affected by the cold, and I'll come back to that because there's ways that you can change nitrogen application to very much reduce that, and that's been the New Zealand experience for some time. So even in very cold environments, we hold good leaf through winter. So on one hand there, we shouldn't accept that they necessarily will go. But if they go in winter when they're frosted off and they lie down as the sort of brown and slimy leaf, then their nutritional content is not very far different from the green leaf. The problem is in autumn. If they go with foliar disease in autumn and they go slowly, then there's a genuine loss of nutrient to the system. So the strict ones in winter with some of that going down, if you watch cattle and sheep on them, they will happily eat those brown leaf just the way that they would eat green leaf. And in some cases in Scotland right at the moment, there are some crops that were very low dry matter crops that were completely frosted and then thawed on a couple of occasions, and in those cases everything above the soil line is that colour, and ewes will eat them indistinguishably from normal beet. So there isn't a great shift in that nutrient, but you need to be quite careful with young stock that it is actually winter loss and not autumn losses.
Perfect, thank you very much. That's all the questions for now, so if we hand over to Marc then, and if everybody keeps putting their questions in throughout, and we'll have another question session at the end.
Great, right, thanks very much. So what I thought I would do is, there's been quite a lot of talk about herbal leys recently. Obviously we've got SFI in England, and then we've got the old stewardship scheme of GS4 putting herbal leys in, and obviously now we've got SAM3 as well, which has come in. We've also got the Growing for the Environment grant in Wales. I'm not really sure in Scotland if they've got anything similar, but again, a lot of these schemes are being used quite heavily across the country. So yeah, SAM3, it's got a payment of up to £380 a hectare, and the background behind it is that it's looking at sort of 5 species of grass, 3 from legumes and 5 from herbs. So really, it's what can we do to integrate that into your farming system, or into the arable system really. So coming back to the herbal leys, what are the benefits of them? So the first thing is that deeper rooting. So as we know, we've had a couple of dry summers, This last year, it was particularly the late spring going into the middle of summer before the rain came, and the season before it was very much a dry season throughout. So the most important point is that these crops continue to keep growing, while your ryegrass traditionally would go to head or go to seed and would actually be very undigestible to those stock, which is not what we're wanting. We're wanting to keep those plants growing, so we've got some forage for those stock throughout. The other important side of it, it's increasing that soil structure and biology, and that's something particularly arable farms are looking for. Hopefully we're aiming to put down a little bit more organic matter just to make those soils work much better going forward. Of course, that's why we're getting the money, really. It's because they're wanting more invertebrates and wildlife. So when you're walking through these swards compared to ryegrass, there's lots of insects and wildlife there, and the bird count's much higher. Of course, like I was mentioning before, that digestibility is key for stock. So we've got lots of clovers, lots of plantain and chicory, and these maintain that digestibility through those summer months. So the stock performance is so much better throughout. Particularly from sheep, we've seen that an increase of milk yields of up to 20%. And particularly for cattle, we're able to get live weight gains of near that kilo a day for stock in their first year, which is usually ahead of what we'd be capable of from ryegrass swards. And then in terms of performance, this is just a slide taken from Field Options, and it was just showing the performance compared to a straight sward of up to 250 kilos of nitrogen. And then we've got several different herbal ley mixes going across there. But as you can see, the white herbal grazing mix is not far from behind the 250 nitrogen level. So these swards can perform very, very well, and particularly in drought times as well. So that's where we're hoping to make up the difference when that ryegrass really starts to fail. So how do we fit this into our cattle system? So what I've done is just taking a couple of examples of dairy beef, again, because ABP and Blade are on the call. So really, if you're looking to get autumn-born calves as weanlings in the spring, so we're talking January, February time, normally those cattle actually come on ad-lib concentrates and feed. And what you want to do then is to transition them off that mix as quick as possible. So these are cattle just at home where we've got them onto good quality silage. We try and reduce that concentrates down to about 1 kilo a day. And then we're trying to then go out and utilize those grass and herbal leys as quick as possible. So the cattle you can see here, these are in their first season. They'd be about 200 kilos going out onto the herbal leys in the spring. And then we're aiming for that nearly 1 kilo a day if we can achieve it throughout. So when we're getting to the end of the season, hopefully we put on at least 150 kilos. And then we've got some big weights there. They're almost up to 350, 400 kilos plus going on to the fodder beet in the winter time. So what we're trying to achieve is a very low cost base for the system. The other system we're then looking at is that if we're looking for spring-born cattle, we'll actually have them out grazing for that first season. And then they'll be out onto the herbal ley again the second season after going on to fodder beet, and then we'll finally hopefully get to the fodder beet at the end of that season. So again, we're looking for growth rates probably of about 1.3, 1.4 off those herbal leys throughout in that second season as well. So what we've got here in front of us is this is actually from a farm up in Nottingham, and these are actually what we would call the younger age group, or the R1s. So these would be cattle of about 200 to 250 kilos going on the fodder beet, and we're looking for a nice long face there, and hopefully we're achieving about 0.9 to a kilo a day within this system. So hopefully the cattle only housed for that 2 months early in the spring, and for the remainder of the time they're aiming to be finished completely on fodder beet on the herbal leys. Of course, we've then got the spring kind of system. So in that case, they're on the fodder beet twice, and this is the size of cattle which Jim mentioned you'd be aiming to finish intensely directly off the fodder beet. Most of these cattle would be 450 kilos plus, and aiming for that 120 days finishing period. So these cattle could be taken straight off the fodder beet. And that again would be a nice simple system which would cut your cost of production down completely. Okay, so what I've also been asked to cover are just looking at the soil health and any issues and what we can do to try and avoid soil loss really, and to make it as comfortable as possible for those animals. So again, perception is a massive thing. We've got people with phones around all the time, so we're wanting to make that picture on the outwintering as good as possible. So generally, the first thing I would look at is site selection. So we're looking at lower rainfall areas. So if you've got 2 or 3 meters of rainfall, I'd probably knock this on its head completely, really, and you're stuck to more of those house systems, looking to get those cattle out early to grass on the edges of the year. We're also looking for free draining fields, sort of sandy silts, brashy, or shale and rock. And these are where the cattle are going to be able to lie down. And again, very free draining. And probably what really affects the loss of growth rate on fodder beet is if these cattle are standing in shit basically for that whole winter. So we're really wanting them to thrive, and that free draining soil is a vital part to it. Again, it's been a very tricky winter for most farms because of the wet conditions. So that's a very important side to it. The other point is we're looking for it to be as flat as possible. Again, you know, steeper banks can be used, but they've got to be very much well thought of. Again, if it's flat, unlike tractors going over crops in the winter, what cattle do is make footprints, and you don't seem to see that runoff directly because the rainwater is caught in those hoof prints. The other thing we're looking at are buffer strips around the edges of fields. So again, what we're aiming to do is try and keep 5–10 meters of grass buffer around the outside, and then you're aiming to actually electric fence these off, and then the cattle can't touch those, and it just stops any sediment issues or any runoff at all. So that's a key part to the system during the winter months. So steeper slopes, can it be done? Well, steeper slopes are generally drier areas anyway. I know on our farm at home they particularly are. So we are actually grazing the steeper slopes. Probably the key thing to work out is when you want to graze it in the season. So what we would tend to do is graze the steepest fields last. So we're probably talking late February and March. And that's because the days are getting longer, it's drier weather, and there's less chance of that soil lifting. And of course, we're on those fields pretty quick, and they're getting ploughed into the next crop or being put into grass quite quickly. The other thing, we also look at steeper slopes. Traditionally, farmers should be grazing those down the hill. So again, all the sediment is running through the crop. But what we do find in some situations, in very wet conditions, we're better off going across the field quickly sideways, because sometimes what you can have is the stock will run across the line and ridge it. And sometimes if you do hit a wet patch, that soil can come down with the cattle. So it might be easier to go across the field in some situations. Temporary water, that's a key part to it. Again, Jim normally says that we don't need a lot of water, and that's true enough. But if you're feeding a lot of supplement or a lot of dry haylage or silage, you do need to have that temporary water with you. And the key to that is back fencing and moving the water along with you. And then you're not making those stock walk several hundred yards back and forth and making a trench across the field as such. And then
I think we might have just lost connection again. I'll do my best to get Marc back online. We'll get that back for you. Oh, he's here. There we go. You're just on mute, I think, Mark. We can't hear you, Mark. Okay.
Is a dairy setup. Sorry, can you hear Emma?
Yeah, we've just got you back then when you just flicked onto that slide. So if you just start from the beginning of this slide, that'd be perfect.
Okay, that's great.
Thank you.
Yes. So this is a dairy setup for dry cows down in Devon. We actually visited this farm on Tuesday as part of our Fodder Beet tour this week, and it's probably one of the best setups we've seen really for managing that risk of soil erosion in very, very challenging times. So the field was gently sloping down the hill, so obviously the farmer had started at the top of the hill. On the left-hand side, he's got the fodder beet, and then on the right-hand side, he's giving a run back, an area where he was feeding bales for the cattle. And this system was working very, very well. So this was his first choice of what he could do. He also had a plan B and a plan C for when things were very, very wet. So of course, at the weekend, about 50 mil of rain came through across the country. So during this time, he was using next year's fodder beet field as a sacrifice. So this was in grass. He placed several bales out on that, and that's where the cattle went during those times. The other option he also uses is that he's able to put the cattle on tracks and also in yards if he does have those bad conditions. So to manage with these harsher conditions, it's vital that you've got a couple of backup plans, and it's very, very flexible for you. And this was just again showing the setup with some dairy heifers. We've got fodder beet on the left-hand side and some rye on the field just in front. And there was strip grazing, and we're able to come back and forth throughout. And again, we were finding that it was working very well. So obviously the system looks a lot muddier from distance, but once you get up close to it, you can see the cattle were very, very clean. They were able to go lie back in the distance, and they were actually back fencing the rye, and it was actually growing back through afterwards. So again, it was maintaining that soil throughout. So again, this is one of the best setups we've seen throughout. Again, this is just showing what was happening with the cattle. Again, they were able to go graze grass for a few hours in those wet conditions as well. And again, it was excellently done to prevent any issues. And then the final thing was is the use of crops like forage rye to try and retain that soil during that winter period. So we've had some very mild winters, and one of the easiest things to do is just after the cattle have finished grazing a few acres, is to go on with the quad bike and just spin a little bit of rye onto the surface. No cultivation is required. It will germinate on the surface and hold that soil together. So this is just a picture at home for what we did last winter. And again, a lot of farmers doing this to get that cover back on and prevent any soil erosion. And again, when you're coming into March and early April, this can be grazed again, as it's probably up at about knee height. Okay, good. So hopefully that just kind of covers some of the basics, or some of how we aim to try and set up the systems to make them as simple as possible. So we'll open that back up to you, Emma, and any questions for me and Jim. Yeah, perfect. Thank you, guys. We've got loads of questions coming through, which is great. So the first one, have you got any experience of feeding growing fodder beet direct to sheep? And I guess that's to both of you.
Growing, as in
yeah, I think a standing crop, grazing it. Yeah.
So yes, that's been done in New Zealand for many years, and now for more than 10 years. There would be some millions of sheep that are grazed exactly in that method with no difficulty at all. So yes, it's done at massive scale.
And how would that differ, the ways that you're doing it, how would that differ to the beef?
Well, the concept's the same. They're grazed behind a wire, and really everything that we've come to speak about so far applies to them, with the one exception that they don't require a transition onto beet. They regulate their own intake much better. And in some cases, if the crop is leafy enough, which at the moment is not the UK experience, but certainly now is the New Zealand experience, then there's no supplement required with the crop. They're only on the beet themselves. So it's a very straightforward process with sheep.
Perfect, thank you. Next question, is there a difference in ME per kilo of dry matter of beet dug in September compared to January onwards?
No, none at all.
Okay.
There's no difference anywhere. In fact, one of the advantages of the crop is it's a pretty constant ME of 12 from very early in the autumn right till it goes to seed. Once the reproductive stalk starts going up at about 400 days after sowing, then it takes a lot of the nutrient out of the bulb and the ME changes then. But prior to that, no, it's a very consistent ME across all of that time.
Perfect, thank you. So quite a long question, this next one. With growing the beet, if you narrow the drill spaces from 500 mil to 350 mil, do you carry on with a seed rate of 40,000 seeds per acre, or do you have to up the seed rate, or do you look to extend the seed spacing within the row? So just some questions there about seed rate and the drill.
Yep, so that's the New Zealand experience, and that's one of our shifts in agronomy. So we move from 500 down to 375 or 350, or where we can 300, and we use the same distance within the row, so up the row. So if we decrease the distance between the rows, we use the same distance between them up the rows. So when you do that, for example, if you've got on a hectare, if you have row spaces of 500 mil, you'll have 200 rows across the hectare. And if you move that from 500 mil rows down to 375 rows, then what you find is you'll have 266 rows across that hectare. So if you keep the same spacing of the seeds within the row, going up the row, then you've increased your seed per hectare, and it's the same per acre, by about 30%. And your yield follows that up. So one reason why the yields are higher is that seed row allows you to have more mature plants at the same size at the use typically in autumn or in winter. So the yields are much higher doing that. There's a modest cost in the increase in seed. You normally go to about 120, 130,000 seeds, but it's more than compensated for by a massive increase in yield.
Perfect, thanks Jim. So the next one we've got, on the late application of nitrogen on the beet to maintain the green top, is it better to apply as a foliar nitrogen or a granular application of 50 kilos per hectare?
It's reasonably rare to use foliar nitrogen in New Zealand because it's significantly more expensive than the granular urea. So the large units in the main, and by large units, a good number of these individual operators will have 200 or 300 hectares of beet. In those cases, they would all be spinning on granular urea. If you do that though, it should be noted that we would do it with water. So it'd either be done before rain was expected or with irrigation. So if you don't have the access to that, then foliar nitrogen use with either urea dissolved in water or some of the other commercially available ones is a sensible enough way to do it. But in the main, we've always used granular urea because it was cheaper. Some people have, back in the earlier days, some people said that there was danger with leaves being scorched and burnt and all that, and none of it is true. Even post canopy closure, spinning on 100 kilos of urea, which is approximately 50 kilos of nitrogen, it's perfectly suitable if you can water it on.
Perfect. Next question, is there any benefit to dragging or ripping up the land to pull up any, or ripper the land to pull up any uneaten beet during grazing?
Yes and no. That's a more difficult one to answer. If you've got cultivars that are suitable for the stock you've got there, then there shouldn't be a lot in the ground, and it's perfectly able to be done. But there are some cases in areas where there'd be extreme cold weather followed by thaw, that there's some advantages in using higher dry matter and therefore deeper ones into the ground. And in those cases, yes, using the tines, the pigtails, or what we would call a grubber to prong that beet out of the ground can be an advantage. In most cases in winter, or at least in a large number of cases in New Zealand, it's way too wet to do that. So that would normally happen in spring. But where you could get on to do it, there's no disadvantage in doing it behind them. And I mean, that's already done here in the UK.
Brilliant. I think we've got one for Marc here, which is when using a movable water trough with an above ground pipe, how do you stop the water pipe from freezing?
Yeah, well, normally you've always got a water trough in the field, so usually you'll have a concrete water trough which is fairly well insulated. So when it's frosty, it doesn't really matter about going back over that ground, does it? So really that temporary water and that water pipe is mostly for wet conditions. And as Jim will tell you, really, they're drinking so much water as such by eating the fodder beet that there's no requirement usually, unless you're feeding a huge amount of silage or haylage, which is very dry.
Perfect. Next one, how much of a yield reduction do you see in the crops following a badly damaged soil from grazing, and how does this fit in with improving soil health and regen?
It's reasonably common in New Zealand to have 2 years of beet in a row. So that would be 2 years of beet and then on to something else after it. And the second year crop of beet will almost always be greater than the first year crop of beet. So in answer to it, no, you don't see crop yield decreases. And even that would include some cases where it's reasonably wet and there would be some poaching or pugging by cattle, at least temporarily in quite wet periods. But in the main, for many of the places in the UK that are on beet now, and that would include a lot of the areas towards the east of the country, really there's very little soil damage at all deeper than their hooves. And in those cases, it's not an issue with compaction, and it's certainly not an issue with genuine soil damage. And the structural reality is we just haven't seen reductions in crop after it. It's something that gets talked about all the time, but it's very difficult to see where that's actually happening. And I can say pretty plainly across a very large number of soil types in New Zealand, it just doesn't happen. In fact, the second year, the crops are greater than the first year because the capital fert inputs there, a lot's been recycled by stock, so there's just more nutrient to use.
Did you want to add anything to that from a UK context at all, Marc?
No, it's fairly similar, really. We haven't really seen any yield reductions. I suppose sometimes you can have areas of the field where there's a little bit more plugging by the cattle, but again, something like a subsoiler can lift that if that is an issue, really. But generally, further in the west, you ring a ploughing rotation out of grassland, so you've restructured that soil and it's usually good to go again. In the east, where it's drier, again, you can just scuffle the surface and away you go, really.
There's just been a comment come back from the person that asked that question saying that they get crop yield reductions and they're a fact. So did you want to pick up that conversation offline with them? Would you be happy to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm more than happy to do so. I guess my position on that one would be informed by a really large number of hectares across a lot of rainfall and soil types over a period of about 15 years. So, you know, my first thought around it is it's a complex area with a few things going on, but the knockabout rule is no, there's no damage. But I'd be more than happy to take that up after.
Okay, great. The person that asked that, then, if you want to come back to us afterwards, we'll put you in touch. Another question, which I suspect may have a complex answer, is which variety of beet would you recommend?
Yeah, that can be really hard. Maybe the easiest answer for that would be, at the moment, there's about 26 or so cultivars that are in use in New Zealand, and that would range from some very low dry matter to some very hard ones, almost as hard as sugar beet. If you cropped off both ends of them with a couple of cultivars at each end, the good bulk of them that are in the middle have pretty genuine widespread use, and there isn't very much difference between them. So, for example, there typically isn't a very great difference in yield. There's no difference in most cases with palatability. There's some mild differences in how much leaf they produce between them. Some just produce a whole lot more, but there aren't too many that produce a very low amount of leaf. So in general terms, choosing cultivars isn't as complex as it first sounds. There are some advantages for sheep systems and certainly for replacement dairy heifers. The light end of replacement dairy heifers in the light end of dairy beef, so below 200 kilos in particular, with using some of the very low dry matter forages that are a long way out of the ground. And for sheep systems in general, the deeper, the higher the dry matter the variety is, the deeper it'll be in the ground. And unlike cattle, sheep won't knock them over or pull them out of the ground. So if you do use the higher dry matter varieties, which they'll happily eat, you tend to leave a lot more on the ground and you have to either grub it up or use it later on. So there's some sort of practical and logistical choices around cultivars, but it isn't one of those situations where there's, in most cases, a magic cultivar that is used and is so much better than the others, until you get down to very light cattle. And then there's certainly some that are dominant in the use for them.
There's just a second part of that question which has come in, which is, are there some varieties that are better in different soil conditions? So are there some you'd recommend for certain situations and not others?
No, not really. The only partial exception to that is, as a general rule, the very high dry matter beet varieties aren't suitable for grazing. Like those that are over 20% are often not suitable for grazing. But in a few unusual loamy soil types, cattle can get them out regardless. So, I mean, with that partial exception, no, the soil doesn't really come into play. It's just their depth in the ground and the stock use on top of them.
Great. We've got loads of questions tonight, which is great. Another one is growing beet with a companion... Oh, sorry, what did you say?
We've got lots of time, so...
Yeah, it's a really, really chatty group. It's really good. Is growing beet with a companion crop between the rows an option? And if so, what would work?
In my direct experience of that over many years, it's a total waste of time and money. We've tried lots of it with lots of different varieties for a long time, and we've never had any genuine success in growing the yields that we need with them. When the beet crop's really small, it's wildly influenced by weeds or anything else that's taking that nutrient or water out of the ground. Having said that though, there are some really difficult circumstances where you get a lot of wind damage in particular. So sometimes by sandblasting, sometimes by helicoptering the small plants out of the ground. And in those cases, there can be some advantages in planting them, for example, as strip till into cereal stubble. That can give you some sort of protection. And I believe, and Mark can pick up on this, that there's been in the east of England, there's been the use of co-planted barley that then sprayed out a little bit later as a way of protecting against wind blow and sand damage in some of those sandy soils. You need to be quite careful on that, because unless you have no other options, you could be pretty sure that your yield potential is being reduced by those co-planting arrangements. And then they're certainly not done now in the experienced users in New Zealand, even in those challenging environments. There's often just other ways to go around it. But Mark, you can add that for the UK.
Yeah, no, we haven't really seen any yield reduction in that barley, and it's only really there until the fodder beet's up and going and just giving a little bit of protection to that sandy soil, really. So once they're up and going, the barley's sprayed out, and it hasn't really seen, we haven't really seen any effect on yield. So it's usually a good thing.
Great, thank you. Another one. Can the sugar beet that is used for sugar production, can that be grazed too?
With great difficulty and not well. There's usually two things with that. The sugar beet varieties tend to have low leaf, and the people who are growing sugar beet are trying to maximize the amount of sucrose per hectare. And in those cases, they use a lot less nitrogen, because if they use more nitrogen, then the amino N content in the bulb gets in the way of sugar extraction at the factory. The companies get cranky and they dock you, so you get graded on it and you get less money. So in most cases, sugar beet for sugar beet production will have a very low crude protein in the bulb, and they're not automatically suitable for grazing. On top of that, they're usually very deep, so 80+% of them will be underground, and it's quite rare to have even cattle that are experienced with beet that can get all of them out of the ground. So my first suggestion would be no, don't do it. If the person involved is using it because it's a leftover paddock for sugar or something, then you can graze it carefully, but you're not going to get the same production responses that you would out of better, more suitable fodder beet varieties.
Okay, thank you. We've just got a question around if you're looking at a nitrogen application to retain the leaf into and through winter, how much would you be putting on and when?
So our experience is that we would split our nitrogen use up into 4 applications. So we'd have an application at base fert, we'd have an application that would be in spring, of course, with the sown. We'd have an application before canopy closure, which would typically be late spring or early summer. We'd have another application after canopy closure at the end of summer, which is right on the peak period of dry matter accumulation for the crop, and that would be a canopy closure. And then the last application would be as late as we could put it on. Now, in the New Zealand context, that would be the last month of autumn, which UK audiences find quite unusual, because for you that would be November. So it's worth remembering that we're not using that nitrogen at that point because we're expecting the crop to grow or to change that yield, but it's still metabolically active into quite cold weather, and that nitrogen uptake seems to be strong, and it has a cryoprotective effect, so it can be very effective to do it. There are some regulations in the UK around the use beyond the 1st of September, but there also are some other approaches to it that mean for fodder beet, unlike sugar beet, for fodder beet that under appropriate advice it can be used differently, I understand. So I mean, I would suggest that people take advice from their agronomist on when that would be, but our short answer to that one might be as late as possible. And normally that would be about 50 units of N.
50 units of N. Yeah, we've just had you just answered the last question that came in there, which was how much nitrogen for a crop, please. So you've just answered that. We are moving to the last of the questions now. So we've got, how well is strip till drilling of beet into turf working in New Zealand?
Sorry, can I just add one thing there? I'm not sure if that question was asking how much nitrogen in the last application or how much nitrogen on the crop. Because if it's nitrogen on the crop, it's certainly not 50 units of N. You know, in most cases it would be closer to 200 units of N. So that in kilograms of N, it's the last application that would be 50 units of N. So sorry, just to make that one plain.
No, that was my fault. Sorry. How well is strip till drilling of beet into turf working in New Zealand?
We did a research project on that right back in the beginning of beet use, and there was no difference in yield between strip till and conventional tillage, even with a relatively deep ripping, when the strip till was able to rip it quite deeply. So some of the strip tills can't do that, they're very shallow, and beet usually requires a deeper ripping. But as long as the strip till can do that one, then it's been very effective. And in those cereal stubbles that we talked about before, that's the only use in cereal stubbles where you can do strip till and plant the beet, often with fertilizer down the spout, that banded fert that can go in for them. And that's used very effectively in some challenging environments. It's the minority use. Most cases it's normal cultivation, but it is used very effectively.
Thank you. I'm going to go back to that nitrogen question because I got it wrong again. So the actual question is how much nitrogen on each application for the crop. So we said about 50 on the last one. What are the applications before that?
Yeah, can I preface that by just making one point there to go back to what we said in the end of my presentation, that if we're looking at a 20-ton crop here in the UK, that a well-managed crop there will have about 2% of nitrogen in that total crop. So that'll be 400 kilos of N that it's got out of the ground and it's holding above the ground. So in most cases, if you're doing that regularly, then you're looking at nitrogen depletion rather than nitrogen losses into the soil. So there wouldn't be too many of the very large crops in New Zealand that are grown that have less than approximately 200 kilos of nitrogen that are going on, and that'd be split into 4 applications. So that'd be about 50 units of N at each of the times that we said before. Now, of course, there are some that have lower than that, but in most cases, their yield will be affected. Certainly, their leaf will be affected, and the total nitrogen or crude protein of the plant will be reduced with that. So for grazing, it's different to sugar beet use. That's an important agronomy shift that people should be aware of.
Thanks for raising that. We've just got a couple of questions on lifting beet. So the first one is, how should lifted beet be fed? Does it need to be washed or chopped or anything?
No, never needs to be washed or chopped unless it's being used, as we mentioned before, in the total mixed ration in the shed. And the reason for that is that if cattle are used to total mixed rations and you have unwashed beet and whole beet that's introduced, it often puts quite a bit of soil into that ration, and when it's mixed around, you get refusal of that ration and then decrease in intake. So in the rare
I think we may have lost connection again. I will just double check that, but we may close if I can't get them, Jim and Mark, back quickly. Right, I'll just carry on and we'll see if we can get them back on. But it was just said, I think there's been loads of questions tonight, which is great. We were at the end of the questions anyway. There was just a comment had come through in reference to the person that asked about grazing sheep at the beginning. There was just a comment that had come through from somebody else in the call that said they would be grazing 750 in lamb ewes on beet up until 21 days of lambing, and that works well. So we'll just look. Oh, we may have them back. Have we got you, Mark? I can't hear you just yet, but I can see you. You just want to talk and I'll see if I can hear you again. No. Oh, there we go. We've got you.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I'll just pick up on that. So it's used in lifted beet put out cross pasture, as mentioned before. It can be put out with a wagon. So that lifted beet can be put into a wagon, either a side ejector wagon, a rear ejector wagon, or if needs be, just a tipping wagon that's driven at pace across the pasture, and it can be sort of sprinkled effectively across the pasture. That can be done in dairy in daily breaks, and often with sheep and beef. Once they're transitioned and adapted to that dry matter intake, it can be done in up to 7-day breaks. Another way that it's used when it's lifted, and this is used for both cattle and for sheep, it can be put in windrows across the paddock at the right amounts, and the pasture and the beet together make up a 7-day ration. And that can be left in a windrow. They can just be able to harvest it themselves and to eat it. And after 7 days, the line's moved again and they've got a new windrow. The advantage of that is that windrow can be put out, for example, in autumn at the beginning of winter. Then we can graze across that for the whole of winter, or similarly for spring. So if it's put out there, you can often have a long distance between them.
Great, thank you. And then the last question, which I am going to make the last question of the evening, is the best way to store lifted beet. So have you got any opinions on clamps or anything like that?
Yeah, there's a lot of opinions on that, and it depends a little bit on the ambient climate as well. So, for example, one of the largest seed companies, KWS, have done a lot of work on storing beet in different environments, in cold environments, for example, like Germany. And there's various ways that they can be used very effectively in clamps with large sides. In warmer weather, if you do that, what you tend to do is have less air circulating through it. It tends to set them off a little, and once you get them set off and begin composting, you end up with a lot of trouble. So for example, in the warmer areas in New Zealand, we would normally do a windrow. It's about 3 or 4 meters high, about 6 or 7 meters wide, and that will ordinarily allow enough ventilation through that you don't have that issue with it going to be composted. As a rule, if you're doing that into the cold winter, it doesn't matter very much. You can hold them for a few months. If you're doing it into the warmer months, for example, in spring, you often might only get 2 months out of that. And in very warm weather in summer, you might only get a month or so before you start to degrade them.
Perfect, thank you. And I am going to close it there. So what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to take back control of the screen from you, Mark. I'm going to thank Jim and Marc very much, and I'm going to apologise to the audience for the technical problems we've had. What you can't see is that Jim and Marc are currently sat in a hotel corridor, hoping that nobody walks past them. So yeah, we just had some last minute issues that we needed to sort. Anyway, further resources. So further resources are available on the AHDB website that is on the screen. If you can't find what you're looking for, you've got any further questions on tonight, anything at all, give me a shout. My email address is on the screen, so please do that. We have a YouTube Fodder Beet series that we did with Jim. How long ago will it be now, Jim, that we did that? Was that last year or the year before?
Year before, yeah.
Year before. So pretty much everything you could think about on Fodder Beet that is currently a webinar on the YouTube channel. You'll get an email after this webinar with links to that, so you can go through and select whatever is of most interest to you or where you'd like more information. Just to flag upcoming events that we've got. So Jim and Marc are doing an event in Nottingham tomorrow, and then again in Yorkshire on Friday. So if you're near either of those regions and you'd like to go and see them in person, do get in touch with Marc, and he'll be happy to have you, I'm sure. We've got a few webinars coming up as well tomorrow, one on effective communication, if that's something you're interested in, and then events in Oxford, Chester and Northamptonshire next week. All meetings can be found on the AHDB website. You can either go via the web address that is currently on the screen or Google AHDB events, and that will bring up everything for you as well. The record from tonight will be on YouTube as soon as we can get it up there, and I just apologise for the technical difficulties we've had tonight. Yeah, it is what it is, but I think we've managed with it. So with that, thanks to Marc and Jim. Thank you to Katie as well, who is in the background. And still online tonight, and I will close and encourage you to complete the feedback form that you will have come up on your screens afterwards as well. But thank you, Jim and Marc especially. Does anybody want to say anything else? No, brilliant. Right, I will end the webinar now. Thanks all.
Thanks guys, bye-bye.
Bye.